Good afternoon, everyone. This is Race Revolution, Apologies and Action, Why Brands Need to Do Both. I am Sheena Butler Young, the Deputy Editor at Footwear News. I'm so honored to be here today with two thought leaders in the footwear industry around this idea of diversity, inclusion, race, all those great things. I will let them introduce themselves, starting with Portia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Portia Blunt. I am the apparel operations director at New Balance, and I've been in the industry over 19 years, and being able to have the opportunity to have a conversation like this is amazing. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Portia. James.
My name is James Whitner. I'm the owner of the Whitaker Group, inclusive of I'm a Maniere, social status, APB, and Prosper. Been in the industry for about 15 years. Our business consists of everything from luxury to sneakers and streetwear, and super passionate about Black community and helping others have opportunities.
Thank you. I think this conversation is so long overdue that I'm so excited to be having it yet. I think we're all a little bothered by the need to have a conversation about race on the eve of Juneteenth, nonetheless. But I think it's been really a challenging few weeks for people in the United States and across the world. We have been I've been writing about the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and then before we could even execute this panel this weekend in Atlanta, Rashad Brooks. I think that the nation is really galvanized right now around the conversation of race. And then in due course, we see brands joining the fray. They're putting out marketing messages. They are espousing their D&I goals. There's a lot happening. And that's the reason why this conversation, I think, is necessary today. We're kind of moving a little out of sync, but I'm starting with the key takeaways. We want to let you know what we think you'll leave with today. So diversity and inclusion. Is your brand playing catch up? To be fair, everyone is playing catch up. I don't think anyone would disagree that no brand right now is where they need to be in terms of race and D&I. We'll talk about what's at stake. For a long time, I think brands looked at diversity and inclusion and their efforts, they've geared it towards the Black dollar and what that means. It's so much bigger than the Black dollar right now. How do you get on the right side of the conversation in history? And the value of that apology, why accountability really, really matters in this moment. So we'll start with how we got here, right? It's been decades of climbing, but in the last 3 to 5 years, a lot of brands put their foot on the gas a little bit. We saw the hiring of chief diversity officers, formation of employee resource groups, and a lot of brands stepping out with D&I focused goals. Portia, I want to start with you. Can you walk us through the progression you've seen as someone, at a major brand on the D&I front?
Yeah, for sure, Sheena. I mean, I would even go further back than 3 to 5 years. I would say over the last 10 years, we saw a shift in terms of a focus, a new renewed promise, so to speak, in terms of prioritizing D&I, which is great. That initiated that conversation and got the ball rolling. And you saw the stand-up of ERG groups, affinity groups across various corporate structures. And those things are now looked at as fundamental pillars in the corporate structure, which is fantastic. Where we now have gotten to in terms of a point of evolution is now really enhancing those efforts and continuing to elevate the priority of D&I. Looking at over the years, the proposition to leadership was always D&I is not just a moral imperative, right? It is absolutely a business imperative because the studies show, research shows, we live it, we know that emphasizing and really embracing D&I, and not just from the numbers perspective, but holistically, drives innovation, it drives growth, it drives profitability. And the most basic place to start there, when you look at a conference room table and you have a diverse group, and it's not just race, right? Diversity comes in all shapes and forms. Diversity of thought, you do better. You do better, you move better, you're able to amplify your brand's purpose. And I think that's where this pivotal point, this moment we're in right now, is so important for brands, because although we have been on a path to initiate D&I, now is a pivotal point for us to actually drive it home, let it be a part of our embedded culture, and not so much a task list, right? It's not a check in the box. It is ingrained in who we are. And it's going to come in different flavors across various industries and different brands, but just knowing that has to be where we start to pivot today with the momentum that we're seeing in the movement.
100%. And James, as a Black man who is a business owner in a very and the sneaker community, for example, has had a long history with African Americans and reciprocity, if you will. And you have a role now kind of in driving some of that conversation. How do you view D&I as a small business owner who's also a Black man in this moment?
I think D&I is more of a corporate term. I think at a small business level for my and I could speak for myself. For us, it's who I am. As I wake up as a Black person, so our organization is over 90% Black. But because I think for me, it was always about providing opportunities for other people who come from the same kind of circumstances I come from. So I've always made that a part of what we do. But I think from a corporate perspective, I think it's good that the position exists. But I think we need to see more corporate strategy to go along with just D&I hires. I'm sure we'll get into other parts of that in our conversation, but really
get into it now. I'm very curious because when I put these up here with chief diversity officers and these formation of group and all these strategies that I think are coming out of business schools, what do you see that doesn't work? I think that's a huge thing. I think people are seeing the headlines. Oh, chief diversity officer, we'll hire one too. Oh, employee resource groups, we'll have 3 of those.
Yeah, I think honestly, listen, I'm not going to call it the hire in and of itself BS because you need someone to lead a strategy.
Yeah.
But I'm more interested in seeing a strategy that's transparent. Like, we understand what the mission statement is for most of these brands. We understand what they stand for. We understand what their seasonal messages are about. We understand who endorses them in their products. Why don't we understand what their corporate strategy is and what's their approach to the Black community, for Black people, and how they plan to pay into the communities that they take revenue out of?
Yeah.
That's the thing that I'm most curious to see this develop, and it's the one thing, and it's been my consistent ask of all of our partners or anyone who wants to work to get your organization better.
I think the other thing too, James and Sheena, is, it doesn't mean anything to establish a role of a chief diversity officer. CDOs mean nothing if they don't have the authority and the power to affect change, right? So
Absolutely.
It doesn't mean anything to be a figurehead. These positions really need to be impactful. And so, when you look at kind of that construct, when you have a CDO and they're not necessarily paired up in partnership with the CEO or your board of directors, so that you can have that voice actually mean something, and it's not always a feel good. That role really needs to be pushing and challenging, so that we have those hard conversations. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's not an easy role. The other thing is, I think about colleagues in industry who rightly consistently bring up that it's not about just bringing in a diverse pool of people into the building. That's probably lowest hanging fruit. That's the easiest thing that you can do in terms of shifting, is your hiring. But once you get people in the building, if you don't have the culture and the systems in place to nurture them, to grow them, and for them to be empowered to be a part of the change and to be a part of the system, we really end up being on a hamster's wheel. And that's where we really need to empower these roles and empower these affinity groups, empower these departments to actually do the work they have been set up to do, which goes back to what I said. It's not a nice to have. We really have to be honest about it being a priority. right?
And to add into what you're saying, a lot of what we're seeing is also contradictory messages. To your point, right?
Mm-hmm.
We see brands contradicting themselves. If you take the NFL for example, right? And 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it was horrible to kneel, right? We weren't representing the flag. People didn't want to connect with the message that it wasn't about the American flag. It was never about the flag. It was always about the injustices. So now you start looking at um, those guys step forward, and you gotta take them at face value when they step forward. But then you also have to look at that half of the owners support one of the most divisive presidents in the history of in American history. So I think brands have to be very consistent with their messaging and understand what they're putting out at all times. And to Portia's point, if you're not empowering the person you put in that role,
Yeah.
it's just you're making empty promises.
Yeah, I mean, that's super valid because I think one of the things we've seen since the sort of the introduction of the CDO role, especially in fashion, is that structurally those CDOs are reporting to HR and not to the CEO. That's one thing that's already kind of set that role back.
Right, which is a problem, Sheena. That's why I'm saying that role, it should not sit solely under HR. That role should be in partnership with their HR partners and the chief human resource officer. They should be working in partnership, in tandem. That CEO role really needs to be that ear, that counsel, that sounding board for the CEO, because you're driving across not just workplace and workforce, change.
Yeah.
You're driving across everything, the perception and tone and messaging of the brand, culture, all of that. It's all intertwined.
I'll take it a step further and even say, because you mentioned before, and sorry for cutting you off, Sheena, but you mentioned before, comfort and growth can't live in the same place.
Mm.
And HR's job is to keep things streamlined, tight, organized. Change. You can't process change that way. What we need across our industry is radical change. It, it, D&I can't work through HR. The two things don't go together.
Yeah.
DNR has to report to someone at a much higher level, preferably the CEO, right? Because that person needs the autonomy and the ability to work without the constraints of HR.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, we got to look at it as, because it's new, it's in its infancy, relatively, right? Like if we were to look at this on a spectrum, I would say this is rather elementary at level. No one's really at a kind of a PhD level there, but you really have to give them that autonomy, and you have to think of a CDO role as an internal disruptor, right? Like a disruptor for change, and it's just a different way of thinking, and we don't think that way. And if we do, imagine the things you start to uncover. You're giving voice to your younger associates. You're giving voice to the community by which you're serving, supporting, and providing service to. That role could easily amplify that in a way that the other C-suite roles don't necessarily do,
100%. I think every time as we're speaking, I keep saying, by the way, this is against the backdrop of a pandemic, right?
Right.
And one of the things that we reported on a lot at Footwear News in recent months was, what was one of the first roles that we saw furloughed, like the big roles? Never mind people taking pay cuts in the other C-suite roles. A lot of chief diversity officers were the first to be furloughed. And then we see a pandemic that is disproportionately affecting your Black employees, your Hispanic employees, and you have no one on the team right now that's thinking about how you can support them. And then what does the return to the office look like when you were, the new haves and the new have-nots, right? Who's lost a family member, who was furloughed and who was not furloughed. So I get on my soapbox about that, but it's a great observation about the importance of the CEO, where they should be reporting, and kind of why that matters. I want to talk a little bit about what's at stake right now, right? We talked about the idea of it used to be the Black dollar and what that represented, but now everyone's, for better or worse, they're woke, right? Everyone's talking about diversity, they're talking about race. From where you sit, from where you both sit, as we see brands like, Nike's always had this kinds of messages. We know that that's their brand ethos. But I saw JCPenney is now celebrating Juneteenth as a paid company holiday. Kohl's, I shared this with you guys offline. I got an email from the Kohl's CEO with like pretty much Black Lives Matter, and I was like, this is interesting. So we've got all these brands joining the fray, and because they know what's at stake, right, in some way. But from where you sit as Black professionals, what do you think the community reaction is to a lot of these messages?
I think my personal reaction and the people I speak to, the messages don't mean anything. Like, especially from companies who don't have a history of saying or doing anything. I think it should be Black Lives Matter is the most important narrative, but I think one that's equally important is understand white privilege. I think this is a moment for white people to really look in and understand their privilege, and understand that acknowledgement of the privilege doesn't make you a racist. It just means you have to think about what advantages you have been given because you were born white, and what are the disadvantages that Black Americans face every day. And if we stop right there and get white people to level set on that, it'll help them be more authentic.
This is one of those questions where I struggle with it because, like you, Sheena, you get, these emails coming across, you're seeing it on social, so you're inundated with it. So that's the first thing. So it's mental, it's exhausting, and it's a lot of noise. In one way, I personally come from the perspective that, okay, I appreciate it. That's great. I want you to be on this path. But to James' point, we all naturally kind of question, is this an authentic position? And for me personally, and we talked about this when we had our initial conversations. It's not about what you're saying or even doing right now. Personally, the truth will be in the pudding. Come October, come November, come December, come January, when we regroup and have this conversation in 2021, that's going to tell the truth about where the true, genuine, authentic nature of these announcements and proclamations really are from a brand. And so, it's going to take some time, and I want to be, I try and endeavor to be a patient person. But I think it's going to take some time to really see what that action and that accountability is truly going to look like and to be on a consistent basis for these brands. And that's what I personally want to hold everybody to. If you're going to say we're going to commit X amount to said Black focused community, outreach, whatever that is, and it's not specific and it's not specifically saying this is how we're going to contribute, be prepared for what that looks like in terms of the backlash. Because as much as you're being called out on it right now, in terms of standing up, speaking out, and saying what you're going to do, we have the responsibility to hold them to that 2 months from now, a year from now, to say, you said, let me hold up that post.
Accountability. Yes.
And it
doesn't matter when it's not sexy,
Right.
And even more so, right? What does accountability look like, right? Like, we understand what's at stake for companies, and everyone's making statements. And I agree with you completely. This is a long journey. Like, we're finally taking a stance and taking a position. But as people, as individuals, as media, who's taking a tally to make sure everyone shows up, to make sure that accountability is transparent and real? Like, we can't just pick on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 companies. Like, we have to be willing to call. We have to be willing, as consumers, as individuals, to hold people to real account by potentially not supporting them if they don't invest in supporting us.
Yeah, and I think that's like job of collective, outside industry organizations to help champion that effort in terms of that, James, because I think that's a great call out, because individual brands aren't going to be able to police other ones, right? And so, when you have the industry support, whether it's an association or, for us in footwear, we have African American Footwear Forum, using those platforms to drive accountability, to drive transparency in the numbers, because we are a collective voice. You
Yep.
know, it's not that there's just Black people at Nike. There are Black people in every company, and we may not be aligned and happy with the volume and the quantity, but we exist, and we
Yeah.
are there, and we are contributing. And so if we get that collective voice from an industry perspective and have some mechanism by which we can drive that accountability for long-term growth and change, it's important. And I think that's across the board in every industry, whether it's CDFA, like whoever, in fashion, in tech, everywhere.
I want
And
to
me,
talk a bit
go
about
ahead, Sheena.
responsibility, by the way. When we talk about being, like you said earlier, there are all these organizations have Black talents at whatever level they are, that whose responsibility is it to raise issues, and then the weight of that? Like if you are, like you just talked about the kind of the disparity in numbers. So if there's 3 Black people on your team and that we're in this moment, you're the one that always has to say, that marketing message won't land, that's going to offend, or whatever. That comes with it a level of responsibility. I think I gladly take it, but it's heavy, right?
It is heavy.
Well, but there also has to be support, right? That's where
Yeah.
the support comes in, and you got to start asking yourself, what's the responsibility in media, right? Media is quick to cover things after it all blows up, but what's the responsibility in media to help maintain its coverage and give those people a voice to support them? Like
Yeah.
who's willing to support them and rally behind them? That's where individual accountability becomes important, because we can't allow that burden to sit on those 3 companies, on those 3 employees.
Right.
We have to as a community rally around not just our industry but the entire world for change,
Yeah.
right? Because if we continue to have these little pockets of bubbles, we'll continue to get what we've been getting.
Yeah, absolutely, James. I agree.
Oh, go ahead, Portia.
No, but I was just going to say, just to bring that point back home, it's not just the collective responsibility as for us as Black employees or
Yes.
the Black representative, right? So always caution people. I am not speaking for the collective body, for my culture. I can
Yes.
speak for myself, Portia Blunt, and know my experience and know what I have seen. The collective responsibility rests with our white peers, our non-Black peers, who have to step up with us. I can't do it all alone. Sheena can't do it all alone. James can't do it alone. And then in turn, you end up being that one voice. Oh, you're going to get Portia upset, or she's
Yeah.
going to call you on it.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
no, I need, Rick and Jem and whoever else to
Yeah.
call everybody out too,
Which
Yeah.
because then it feels different.
Yeah.
It
which
feels
is
different.
which is why, and I'll keep drilling it home, which is why the 2 words white privilege are so important.
Yeah.
Nothing changes. White people make, or the majority in this country, nothing changes unless they have willingness to change and understand that this is about them probably more than it is about us, because it's
Yeah.
about their treatment historically of us. And obviously we can't indict them for the sins of their fathers, but they have to understand where we are and what their responsibility is to where we are and where we need to go.
There's a great question that I'm really curious to your guys' answer on it. It's from Kiara. She's asking, is it possible for a chief diversity officer to be white and to be able to carry the message of diversity? Does this role require it to be a non-white person? Very interesting question.
I think it could be white or Black.
Yeah.
I think the person has to be invested in doing the right things for the right reasons, and spend a lot of time learning the issues. If you aren't Black, there are going to be things that you just don't naturally understand. But I've watched people, in some of the work that I've been doing, with specific people and specific companies. I've watched them really dig in to do the work to understand what the issues are. And honestly, I've seen white people dig in more than some Black people at high
Yeah,
levels, right? So I,
absolutely,
I
James.
think it's about commitment more than it is about color.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think thinking that a CDO role has to be relegated to a certain model is counter in general to what the purpose of that role really is, right? And to James's point, that role is unique in that person really needs to be enlightened, vested and committed. I love that you said that, committed to understanding all facets of that diversity sphere, and not just committed to it but amplifying it, right? So that role is unique in that you have so much work to do to understand specific communities' needs, articulate those gaps, and drive change specifically across all of them, not just exclusively to one. So yeah, I think anyone who is a champion, who is well learned and educated and open and really lives in a true growth mindset, it could flourish in a role like that. So it's not
Yes.
a one size fits all.
And the only thing I'll add to that is too, because there's a cynical person that's listening to this right now and says, what happens when the white organization puts the white person in who gives you all that lip service? That's when the level of transparency, and that's when you kind of need the accountability piece is so important, right? And the voice, everyone's individual voice has to be important, because the person that's leading it, if they're as good as they're supposed to be, they're taking the time to connect, and they understand the importance of getting into the trenches of the organization and and to the top of the ivory towers.
Absolutely.
Jeffrey had a question about, I think, related to this CDO and HR. What are some actions that us as managers can take with HR to ensure we are widening our talent pool search to be more diverse of groups of candidates? What steps are available for us to work with our HR partners to explore different avenues, new avenues in the community?
Portia, you
So
want to go? Go
yeah,
ahead.
no, yeah, I can take that. So from my perspective, I think, as hiring managers, that's your first responsibility, to look at as many diverse candidates as you can. And the first step to do that is when you meet with your recruiter or your HR partner, demand that. Say, I don't want cookie cutter. It has got to be a diverse pool. They're going to challenge you on it. They're going to say, well, this is the best that we could get. No, keep pushing, keep saying, well, you know what, I would rather have someone that's a little bit more interesting and unique in experience. The other thing to think about is we as managers should have these conversations with HR, in that, we have preset kind of gates already implemented and in place that eliminates bodies of candidates even before a hiring manager even has the opportunity to vet a short list. And that goes as far as, prerequisites for college. If the job rec says 4-year experience, or you need an MBA, or you need to have some affiliation with the outdoor industry, or you need to be a past runner, those things are key triggers to exclude people. And if we can get to a place where the job descriptions, the recs are more inclusive in terms of looking at more diverse pools, that's where we can start to impact things. Because if our HR is always going to a specific corridor for hiring or recruiting from out of college, and you can look at it and see, you can do a general tally in your office to say, oh, everybody went to Virginia Tech and everybody went to UVA. I'm from Virginia, so I'm calling out my Hokies, but that's not necessarily super diverse, right? So are we looking at West Coast schools? Are we looking at HBCUs? Are we looking at vocational training? Are we looking at different things? Because the world is different. Our Gen Zs are not necessarily going to take a traditional path. So they may have gotten an ample amount of experience through just working and building a business, taking an entrepreneurial path like James, and now wanting to come and contribute in a corporate structure. Those candidates likely don't even get an opportunity to be seen because of those constructs. So I think we have to do the work to start having those conversations to take those walls down so that hiring managers have a more broad scope. And again, as a hiring manager, demand it. Really, you have to push it.
And something I'll add too is, I think it's important for companies to get intentional about building their bench.
Yeah.
If you know you have issues with minority candidate pool, and you know that there's really high requirements to hire people into the organization, go back to the high school level. Get into some Title I high schools. What scholarship programs are you offering? What internship programs are you offering?
Yeah.
Are you being intentional about building your bench through high school into college to create what your future organization will look like. I think it's the responsibility of all HR departments and hiring managers to have a long term, to think long term, and to think about not just where we are today, but how will the future look, if that makes sense. And I also drilling on HBCUs. Shame on any company that doesn't have a relationship with HBCUs. There's tons of talented Black kids graduating every year that aren't being acknowledged and aren't getting the level of placement that they should.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit on something super important, James. Sheena, you asked at the top of our conversation about what's at stake. Our future, the future is at stake, right? So if we're not doing the work to ensure a pipeline, another industry leader who I, think so highly of, has been a great mentor to me. Dwayne Edwards has been so focused on that specific to the footwear industry in terms of creating a pipeline.
Yes.
Not just, what we feel comfortable going to. And you're absolutely right, James. It starts I would even push back. It would go all the way to middle school to start those conversations of what's available to these kids, what your future could look like. Not everyone's going to be a footwear designer, but you could absolutely be a product manager. You can absolutely be a marketer. You could absolutely be a developer and contribute to the industry and maximize and optimize your skill set and talent.
I think that's why I pulled. Oh, sorry, James. You have a thought? Go ahead.
No. I was going to mention something that we mentioned. We said something earlier about, because culture came up, but I don't think people understand the importance of, once you attract Black talent, you're not going to have an organization of people who gets excited to be there if you don't have the culture to keep them. So that's something that I'm just throwing it out there to make sure we get into it at some point. But
let's get into it now.
That's exactly right.
Line of like, how do companies take what they're doing externally? So I pulled this slide up because there's this idea that there's two parts of it. It's the message you put out there, right? And this is particularly the reason why we've kind of, you both are in the sneaker world. I think particularly when it comes to Black people and footwear, the sneaker bucket is particularly challenged because there's a relationship of a lot of, it's a huge demographic, African Americans. There's a lot of borrowing of cultural ideologies. And when you have a mismatched relationship where ideas are taken and nothing is given in return, and I'm not talking about the buying the sneaker, that's a transaction, but there's a relationship that lacks, I think, reciprocity, and people feel it. And that's why the sneaker brands get called out the most when these moments happen. And I think that brands should be looking at it from both ways. Like, what's the message externally that you're putting out? Is that aligned with the demo you're speaking to? But also, how is it aligned internally around your culture? So I think this is a good moment, James, if you have thoughts on culture and how you develop that outside hiring, Black. How do you develop a culture?
Hiring. Go ahead, James.
No, go ahead, Portia.
The hiring, like I said, hiring is the easiest part.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, that's easy. That's low hanging fruit. You can do that. Those are easy transactional numbers you can, bolster to say we are doing what we're supposed to do. Actually, you're not. Because when we start to look at, the comfort level that a younger associate it's Black, or a younger associate that's a person of color, and they don't feel comfortable speaking up in a meeting, or they don't feel like they have somewhere to go to share a view or to share experience, then there's a problem in the culture, right? Mm-hmm. And so if there weren't systemic problems in the culture across the board, and I'll speak specifically around footwear industry, we would not be feeling and seeing the uprising that we are currently. And it's not just a moment in time, and Sheena can attest to it. It's not a moment in time. This has been years of voices and yelling out, please listen to us, right? We have a place here. And that also goes to just simple things, clarity and transparency in terms of building development plans for your Black associates. These young associates want to know where I'm here. I've come in, I'm a junior associate. Where do I go? Are you vested in me? Do you care enough for me to develop me, to show me, mentorship, sponsoring? I talk on this all the time that you can have all the mentors in the world, but if we as managers, as our non-Black peers aren't stepping up to sponsor these young Black associates so that their perspective of culture starts to shift, because you're showing trust in their abilities, you are showing a vested interest in their development and career path, that all adds itself to how culture starts to manifest itself, and support these things we're saying are important to us. So, giving voice and trusting it. And oh, by the way, you may not like what they have to say. So
Yeah.
you have to be open and honest enough with yourself to take that feedback, and process that and understand where you have been contributing there.
And something I'll add too is most Black people don't trust HR. If you have if
Police,
you
right?
I'm
It's like
sorry.
it's like calling 911. A lot
Exactly. So if you have an organization full of white people, right, and then you have less than 5% or even less than 10% Black people in an organization, there's a disconnect to start. So let's start there, right? So I think it's important for first, there has to be some level of trust that's established, and there has to be intent around the company to create a culture that that helps the Black employees there connect with their white counterparts. And we said that before, and I'm going to say it again. White people have to openly acknowledge the work they're doing on themselves, the
Yeah.
work they're doing at the company, and their privilege. And they have to be comfortable acknowledging that to their Black peers, because if not, Black people are never going to trust them and the culture will never grow. Second, to echo Portia's point, there has to be some level of professional development, right? Um, Corporations have to be willing to spend dollar for dollar and invest it in the Black talent that they're bringing in. If you bring in 100 new Black employees, and you don't have a culture now, or you have a culture that's um, uh, significantly white, and people who are working on it and just really discovering what the privilege means to them, a lot of those people aren't in a position to help develop the culture. So are you willing to spend more dollars to go out to bring in life coaches, professional development coaches, and
Yep.
people who help create a North Star for what the organization is going to
Yep.
look like tomorrow, so everyone can work towards tomorrow and not get stuck on today?
And I think
So,
that's is so important, James. Sorry, Sheena.
oh, go ahead.
It's okay for companies to say we don't know how to do this.
Yeah.
That, in my mind, that's a first step towards progress. We don't know, we don't have the answers, so that then you can look outside of your, obviously in the building we don't know. So bring those resources in. Create advisory boards. Look for outside counsel. There are plenty of agencies, there are plenty of consultants that do this work that can help shape this for your individual corporate culture to be meaningful for you, and for you to be impactful across the board from an industry perspective. So, I have been doing some self-reflection on that
Yeah.
personally, in that it's okay. I personally want to hear that. When I started talking about the social media posts and the announcements, the ones that really set with me, and I said, "Oh wow,
Yeah.
okay, I'm looking at you differently in a good way," are
Yeah.
the ones that just upfront said, "We don't have the answers. We
Yeah.
know we probably weren't doing the right things, but we want to do better, and we're open. We're open to understand how we do that, because everyone doesn't know. Because if they did, we wouldn't be having this conversation,
That part, PSA. If we are where we are,
Yeah.
most
right?"
people
So,
most
yeah.
people need to be acknowledging that they were a part of the problem, and they need to focus on understanding the solution before they
Yeah.
start throwing darts against the board, and we end up back where we were.
Yeah. I mean, I think you guys are hinting towards the apology. I just want to throw in a quick note. Somebody made a comment in the chat and they said, they're nervous about the downsizing of like with the pandemic. You're bringing in these Black talent and you might not move the needle. It made me think about the phenomenon that they're calling the glass cliff for women, right? When a company is just at its worst, we've seen it. I'll just say with J.C. Penney and a few others. The stock price is $1, everything's going bad. They bring in a woman. What's scary right now is the companies are not in the best financial shape, right? A lot of them, this is, one of the coronavirus pandemic. They're balance sheets are in disarray, and they start bringing in all this Black talent, and business looks bad, and it gets kind of inadvertently attached to the Black talent. So I wonder what your thoughts are right now that we're having this big cultural moment for people of color at a time that the economy is so bad. So you go, you get hired to be the CEO of a brand because we love Black people right now, but then you get attached to the failure because we're in a weird place economically.
Honestly, narratives are cop-outs. Narratives are issue in every corporation, every publicly traded business. People put out narratives to give people reason or as a cop-out for failure or for personal failure or corporate failure or failure within your department. So that's BS. Like in we have to be in part of our accountability conversation has to be we have to have willingness to call BS
Yes.
BS. If you just say we're failing right now because that narrative, that thought process in and of itself is disgusting. Like, and we have to be willing to call people on that. Like, miss me with all that BS. Whoever is willing to open up with that narrative, they should be let go as soon as they open up with it. That's an excuse.
Yeah. I agree with James on that. I mean, and I think it is a high potential. It is a slippery slope, Sheena, and it definitely is worth calling out. But I agree wholeheartedly that if companies that start to feel, pain points from a financial perspective due to the pandemic, which a lot of people are feeling various, iterations of that. There were symptoms before the pandemic that exacerbated that. That has nothing to do with you bolstering and doing the right thing by diversifying your workforce and talent pool. If anything, those companies that do bring in more diverse talent, Black associates, persons of color, so on and so forth, they probably will weather it much better, quite frankly. So, we got to think about exactly what you said, calling that out, because that is a significant cop out. It's an excuse.
And I'll say something else. Black people are some of the most resilient people in the world. So man, that's a narrative. That oh God, you're gonna
Yeah.
send me on a tangent somewhere. I'm like this close. I'm staying out of it.
Okay, so apologies, right? This has been a huge thing in this moment that we've seen brands take to social media and get criticized for putting out marketing messages around, Black Lives Matter and bringing an end to racial injustice. And, I like to think about it as who should you be listening to? So we know social media is rife with trolls. There are people that just sit there and wait for something to kind of attack. But there has been some credence to what people have been asking brands for. And when I did, like you mentioned, Portia, some introspection myself, I thought, sometimes when I have these D&I conversations, I'm so action focused and I don't want to wallow in all the bad that's happened to Black people over the decades. So I try to say, how can we fix it? How can we fix it? The past few weeks has taught me that I think people do want people to wallow a little bit on the wrongs that they have put out there as companies. Like, you benefited from the Black dollar. What have you done? Say sorry, acknowledge. I likened it to like people getting a divorce and they get alimony, but they still want the spouse to say, I'm sorry, or acknowledge where they messed up. I think people want brands to acknowledge that they've messed up and how they've treated Black people as their demographic they sell to, as well as internally. What is the value in this moment of an apology and an accountability?
I think acknowledgement is very important. It's just I don't think it's realistic to get a huge I'm sorry from a lot of these companies. I don't think they're wired, their leadership is wired or connected that way. So I think, but still, in a lot of cases, it should happen, right? We're seeing all these companies now pull off Aunt Jemima and some of these other companies in other industries coming in and saying, I'm sorry, we're pulling these things off the shelf. We were wrong, right? But I think acknowledgement of the past is very important, and you can't get to the future without understanding why you were where you were. But we can't dwell.
Yes, that's exactly right, James. I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think the acknowledgement is necessary. It's an imperative to move forward. I don't see that the community, the consumers are going to let it slide. I did a little bit of research, and there was some recent studies done with Y Pulse, and they're basically saying millennials and Gen Zs 69% of them are saying this is important to them, and they're holding firm on it. And for me, the numbers speak for itself, right? And typically, numbers, statistics, those values speak to the more senior leadership and the CEOs. Keep driving that on home. And I don't want to dwell on the past, but as a Black woman, that's ingrained, right? Like we adapt and we are resilient, to James's point, but it's always there. And so, these apologies and acknowledgments in my mind really set the stage for going forward. And I want to move forward. And I think what's different about this moment versus others is that I am seeing a collective swell of non-Black peers and leadership in it too. Like I genuinely feel that it's palpable. And so I think we've got to encourage it, because if we just cancel everybody for their past, grievances, what are we doing? I mean, isn't everyone allowed to you've got to forgive, right? We've got to move forward, because otherwise everyone's just going to stay stuck. And in my mind, that's unacceptable. What the focus needs to be is you're rooted in it, you acknowledge it. We know we are who we are because of your culture and because of your community. And now I'm going to by God, I'm going to do the best that we can to make right on that. And so I just want to make sure we set a stage for people to actually have the room to make right on it.
100%. And I think that there's questions that are coming in that are along the lines of recommendations. People want a little bit of advice from you guys around this. One question is, I'm a person of color, not Black. What can I do to remotely support my Black coworkers right now?
I think that question is interesting, because there are a ton of things that you can do, but I think everyone's getting a slew of people who are hitting them up with some level of guilt, right? So you don't want to join a list of you don't want to join people who are reaching out because they kind of have some level of white guilt or guilt for what they haven't done. So I think the most important thing is, first, ask yourself what you can do. Change starts with us. I seen an interesting quote recently that said, when I was younger, I wanted to change the world. Once I got older and much wiser, I understood that I needed to change myself. So I think
Good.
change happens when you commit to changing yourself. In that, you're going to find ways to help the people around you, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Anything, Portia?
Yeah, I would just say, the last couple of weeks have been interesting, because a lot of people have reached out to me and constantly, and I don't want that to go away. Like, feel empowered to do that. But again, I personally am not going to take on the burden of anyone's guilt or misunderstanding or lack of education, but I am going to foster that, right? Like, encourage it. And all I can do is be that soundboard. Yes, please come ask questions, because the worst thing you could do is assume something. And that is what we've been doing in the past, or so afraid that you say something or you're walking on eggshells. Don't do that. I don't need it. That's additional stress I don't have time to manage. So,
Yeah.
I don't think any of us do. So really, that work is do your own personal self-reflection. Take that time. At New Balance, we announced this week that tomorrow will be a company holiday for everyone. Retail, yes, exactly. Big up, yep. And our CEO sent out communication about it. And what struck me about that, when Joe Press sent that email out to us, was how important that made me. It was just important, and it made me feel really happy to identify that this is not just a day off. Take the time to learn, take the time to educate yourself, spend some time on what you can be doing in reflection. Use that time wisely, because as a Black woman, I've had 40 plus years of it. and so, as we come back together, we want to make sure everybody's taking that time and celebrating and honoring, but also learning about the moment and the culture so we can do better in the future.
I'm using my laptop. Great point. And I think, so I had another question here about cancel culture. You guys touched on this a little bit earlier, but someone's asking about canceling people out in this moment, the harm in that, or is that necessary in some cases?
I think we gotta pay attention, right? Because the history of our culture has been people take from it and don't put in.
Yeah.
So we need people to acknowledge that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think we gotta be careful who we cancel, right? Because allies are important for change, but if people aren't moving forward and they're not transparent about what their strategy is going forward, and they're not significantly changing who they've been, then hell yeah, we should cancel them if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree, James. We need to give everybody the opportunity to do what they've said they're going to do. And that's why I go back to when we talked about, come see me in a year in terms of what you said and your promises. And at that point, and you haven't made good on that, then you're on the block for cancellation. But
And
like to just do it arbitrarily, I think we have to give everybody a chance to do right.
And keep in mind, there are some culprits that are much worse off than others, right? If we're talking about companies who have really drilled in and taken from us and been arrogant in how they in their treatment of us, then yeah, there are some people in some companies that probably deserve to be canceled. And I think they know who they are, and I hope they're willing to do the work.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, honestly, we see you. You're on probation. It needs to really essentially be the mentality there, because we have to hold everybody accountable. But I do get weary about it just jumping off and canceling everyone. I do think we've got to give everyone the chance to make good on the promises that they've put forth.
Yes. We have a question about universities and kind of their process in terms of diversity. Do you think that we should also be looking at universities with design majors to make sure that those are diverse? I got my bachelor's at a PWI and graduated with 4 Black designers. Because of this and a lack of hiring entrepreneurs, my entire career path has always been the only Black girl on my team at major brands. I know Portia shouted out D. Wayne earlier for kind of taking on the work of building a pipeline, but he can't be the only one either, right?
Right.
Thoughts
Right.
on kind of the universities and the way apparently Black kids are not either seeing the value of this path in design, or maybe they're not being accepted or can't get in. I don't know.
Well, honestly, I think design as a whole, there's definitely gaps everywhere around our industry for Black designers. So I think that's something that there needs to be a lot of focus on. And universities is definitely a place that it needs to start. But if companies are serious about it, they get down into the high school level and start
Yeah.
helping develop some of that talent and start mentoring them through college. So that'll guarantee that kids understand the importance of going into the field and understand that there's a place for them and their specific eye on the other side of it.
Absolutely. I mean, and that question and comment definitely hits home for me, because it's a mirror image, right? I mean, I went to a PWI as well, and in my graduating class as an apparel design major, I was one of 2, right? So if you take that and look at the numbers there, I went to Virginia Tech, and at that time, I'm not going to date myself too much, but at that time, it was a student body of 26,000 students. I was one of 2 Black designers to graduate from their design program. And that wasn't all that long ago. Well, it was a little bit long ago, but it wasn't all that long ago in the grand scheme. It was only 3 years ago. So, part of that is that, exactly what James said. There is a need for extension of that pipeline, for knowledge on what the industry has to offer, because not everyone's going to be a buyer, not everyone's going to be a designer, not everyone's going to, but there are colorists, there are developers, there are trend analysts, there are all these things, there are stylists, there are all of these jobs that make the engine work. And if our students don't know about it, then shame on us, right? So we need to be doing that work to connect back, create programs. so that they know that. And it's challenging because when you're an only, or you're the first, which I could probably guess that between the three of us, we have lived that
Yeah.
consistently through our careers. You do set a path, right? And so that is the work that we all are doing, the work that Dwayne is doing, the work that so many others are doing to get access in of itself for these design students and just students at large. So,
Yeah, we
and it
call it
takes some reaching back
yeah,
too.
reaching back. I was just going to say, you call that reaching back, and it's a responsibility
Yeah.
that we all have. We talk about, the role of our white and whatever other race allies, but I think that's kind of one of the responsibilities that we often have. I mean, we have a lot of them. I don't resent my responsibilities because I think I always look at it as through the lens of being a parent, and everything that we do is in my mind to make this world a better place for my son and for his kids and my nieces. So I think we would be lying if we say it's not heavy some days, but I wear it because it's worth it, right?
Absolutely.
I think we're gonna wrap up a little bit, but I wanted to leave with you guys people that leave this conversation, one thing that you want them to make sure that they're doing or thinking, an imperative that's heavy on your heart to share when we think about this race revolution and all that we've talked about today.
I think it's about not stopping. I think we got here because people were willing to get into the streets and people were willing to be noisy. My ask with everybody is be accountable to yourself, be accountable to what's happening, and be noisy about it. Being quiet right now, to me, means you're complicit. Like right now, if this should be top of mind for all of us. And my recommendation is to be willing to hold everyone around you accountable. Be willing to be fearless. Be noisy.
Yes, I would echo that, James. I mean, wholeheartedly. In that, a colleague of mine told me this years ago. But be courageous, and it does take a level of courage to be uncomfortable and speak up. And so I think takeaways coming out of a conversation like this: don't let this be the only conversation, is the first thing. Don't let this be the only moment in time you're engaged in trying to understand. Continue that dialogue, continue that conversation. If it feels uncomfortable, then you are on the right path. And so acknowledgement, and acknowledge that there's significant work to be done. And it's okay that there's work to be done. Where I get worried is when we get tired and we think it's just too much. And so it takes that collective body, our non-Black peers, all of us, to keep focused on moving things forward, through accountability, through using your voice, challenging the system, doing that on a consistent basis. So it's accountability, being consistent, and frequency. Like, don't let this be the only opportunity or chance for you to engage in a conversation like this.
Love it.
And the last thing I'll say is, if someone ever, and we've seen this said on social a gazillion times, if anyone ever gets tired of hearing talk about racism, just imagine how we feel. Like, your white privilege gives you the ability to have that thought. Our skin color never. We have to show up as black people every day.
We don't get an opportunity to opt out.
No, we never get to take off.
There are a few questions coming in at the end. I'm going to ask you guys if you want to provide any kind of like your social media handles, anything like that, if people want to find you. I'm sure there's a lot of interest in continuing the conversation, or maybe questions or advice that people might want in the future. Can you drop your handles for our audience, if you don't mind?
Portia, go ahead, please.
What? Oh, my handle?
Yes.
I'm super easy to find. If you can spell my name correctly, you can find me. So it's at Portia Blunt, PortiaBlunt, and I can be found on Instagram or LinkedIn. I'm always open to a LinkedIn connect. It's cumbersome, but I know, I know what it's like to try to find and connect with somebody. So hit me up.
And mine's is just same as Portia. Say it's my name, James.Whitner. I'm as responsive as time allows me to be. So I spend a couple hours every Sunday replying to direct messages, and I also do tons of mentoring through our community platforms that go along with each of our boutiques. We do free game every other week, and we open up a Zoom call for about 500 people to get on and just ask me whatever you want. So I'm wide open and I'm here to help.
Yeah, for
Thank
sure.
you guys so much. I mean, there were so many gems in this conversation. I am so grateful. I think it was a long time coming, but you guys, as I expected, you got the job done. I thank you so much, and thank you guys who've joined us today as well.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you for having us.
everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.